Welcome back, whisky fans. This is probably going to be a fairly brief video today, although it's probably not the first time I've said that. This is going to be a video about a whisky that I picked up on my travels. This is a mystery whisky, bottled by the Whisky Shop, not a sponsor, as part of their Glenkeir Treasures range. And this is the Secret Grain 13-year-old. So some details on the back label there, actually handwritten on. I'm not sure if they actually bottle this from the casks that they have standing in the shop or not, but this one in particular is 13 years old. It is a grain whisky of unknown origin, at least to us. It was filled into the cask on the 19th of May 2008, bottled on the 5th of February this year, 2022. Doesn't actually mention the ABV, which I find very strange, but I would guess it's probably 40%. Now, as for the origin of this whisky, there are only just over half a dozen single grain distilleries in Scotland, so that narrows it down quite a lot. But grain whisky being fairly neutral, a lot of it can be quite samey, so probably going to be very difficult to actually tell. So that's probably about all we know or can find out about this whisky. Let's get some in the glass and see if it's any good. So, also doesn't say anything about chill filtration. Being a grain whisky, there's actually, even though it's 40%, there's actually a good chance that it's not chill filtered, because grain whisky tends not to have the amount of oils and fats and things floating around in it that can cause haze at low ABV or low temperatures. So quite often grain whisky doesn't need to be chill filtered. As for colouring, 13 years old, that's pretty pale, looks pretty natural, so I'm guessing it probably is. So we've got this strange situation where we've got a pretty uneventful, cheapish grain whisky, and there's actually a reasonable chance that it's a better craft presentation than a lot of single malt. Anyway, the 13-year-old Secret Grain on the nose. So, as you would expect, there's been no wacky cask finishes on this one, no wine casks or virgin oak or that I know of or anything like that. So you're getting lots of vanilla custard, creamy vanilla notes. There is also quite a lot of oakiness on the nose of this one, getting some rather peppery, floral, fresh sawn oak, so there's definitely been some active casks involved in the maturation of this one. Also getting some lovely custard notes, a little bit of lime citrus, some dry, cereally, gristy, grainy notes, and a little bit of coconut. Let's see how it tastes. So, on the palate, very light, refined, smooth, no harshness at all. I think that on the palate of this one, that citrus lime note that I got on the nose is slightly more up front on the palate. But again, getting lots of vanilla custard cream biscuits for any of you Brits out there. Some really nice toffeed malt, again peppery wood spice, but it is very smooth, quite light, and with a really nice creaminess. And bearing in mind that this is a grain whisky, and as I said, you do tend to get more of the oils stripped out of a grain whisky by going through that continuous still compared to a batch distilled pot still whisky. It's actually got a very decent mouthfeel, especially considering that I believe this is a 40% whisky. The mouthfeel is pretty good. As for a finish, it's a short finish, probably what you'd expect. Quite light, a little bit of bitter oak, some more of that really nice creaminess, but overall very refined and a little bit simple. So what's the verdict on this one, this 13-year-old Secret Grain whisky from the Glenkeir Treasure range from Whisky Shop? I enjoy it. I know grain whisky is not going to be for everyone, but I think that it's a valid style of whisky, it's a valid subcategory of whisky here in the UK, and it's one that's definitely worth exploring. I think that this grain whisky in particular, I think it's £22 for this 200ml bottle, so it's kind of expensive for what it is and for how much you get. There are cheaper grain whiskies out there, and that's why I bought this small 200ml bottle rather than a full bottle, but I enjoy it, I really do. There are probably not many single malts that I would choose this over, but that's really not the way to think about grain whisky. I think that grain whisky is an entirely different spirit with an entirely different style and different goals to single malt. The same way that it would be wrong to judge something like a good vodka or a good beer against a single malt whisky. I do think that this single grain whisky in particular, anyone that's enjoyed a caramel liqueur or a vanilla infused vodka or anything like that should probably give something like this a go, because it's along similar lines, but especially if you're a whisky drinker, it's better. And the same goes for anyone that likes their smoother and more neutral blended whiskies. I think that what you get with a young, non-cask finished single grain whisky, you're basically getting a good blended whisky without the top dressing of that single malt. And I think that that's definitely interesting enough to be worth giving a go. Now, as I said before, grain whisky is not for everyone. There's going to be a lot of people watching this who are dyed-in-the-wool single malt drinkers who may have decided already that grain whisky is not for you, or you may have just never given it a chance. But I'd say it's definitely worth keeping an eye out for a cheap, youngish bottle of grain whisky as a change of pace. I'd recommend staying away from the ones with wacky cask finishes. I think some people, a minority of whisky producers, are starting to realise that people are beginning to open their eyes to grain whisky, and a lot of them are bottling very high age statements that seem like bargains. And I've said this before, I don't think that grain whisky benefits as much from a long maturation as a more robust, feature-filled spirit like a single malt whisky. And you're also getting a lot of grain whiskies now with like a red wine finish or a Pedro Jimenez or an octave cask finish. And I think that they're probably worth avoiding as well, because if you put, it's such a light and refined and pleasantly simple style of whiskey, grain whisky, that if you put a heavy cask treatment on it, you really lose the essence of what it is. I think that if you are going to give grain whisky a go, you're best off going for something youngish, get something, a decent ABV if you can, preferably something bourbon cask matured, and you may have to do a little bit of digging to find a decent grain whisky that ticks all these boxes, but I think that it's well worth doing, and you might be surprised at how affordable some of it is. If nothing else, it's a really good thing to just have a little bit of occasionally, just to ground your palate. So I'm going to go and enjoy the rest of this grain whisky here. Let me know what your thoughts on grain whisky are. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.